It is the 1st of July 1986, and at New Jersey's Lakehurst Naval Air Engineering Center, a bizarre-looking airship is taking to the skies for the first time. But only minutes in, something is wrong. The huge aircraft is breaking apart. Only a short while earlier, the strange vehicle had emerged from one of the airbase's huge hangars. To any onlookers, it must have seemed like a portal to the past. Lakehurst was once home to the US Navy's fleet of airships, but they had been decommissioned almost 3 decades ago. The history of the airship runs deep at Lakehurst. It was here on the 6th of May 1937 that the infamous Hindenburg came crashing to the ground in a tangle of metal and burning fabric, killing 36 people and hastening the end of the age of the airship.
It's burning and bursting into flames and it's falling on the morning fast, and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes.
While the large balloon envelope may have looked like a vision of the past, what was suspended underneath was most definitely not. A bizarre forest of scaffolding and support beams formed 4 arms, each holding aloft a helicopter, or at least the front half of one. The tails had been crudely chopped off, leaving only the cockpits and main rotors bolted onto the frame. Its creators, nervously gathered around, hoped that it might one day be the future of heavy-lift aircraft. But years overdue and millions of dollars over budget, if it doesn't fly tonight, the entire project and all of their years of work may come to an end. It all rode on this flight.
Boys got guts, to tell you that. Why is that? I'll be honest with you, it looks like a hell of a configuration, you know what I mean?
The clatter of the 4 helicopter engines erupts across the airfield. They spin up, bite into the air, and begin lifting the ungainly contraption off the ground. It is the first successful flight of the Piasecki PA-97 Helistat. But only minutes in, it becomes immediately clear the aircraft isn't working. The entire structure begins to shake and twist, but before the pilots can bring it safely to the ground, one man is dead. Tens of millions of dollars worth and years of development is now scattered across a New Jersey airfield. But what on earth happened? What was the Piasecki PA-97 Helistat, and what was it intended to be? And how did a project like this make it so far through development? How was something with so many clear flaws even able to get off the ground? It's a story and perhaps a lesson in ambition pushed beyond its limits, of ignored warnings and sunk cost fallacies, and of a promising concept whose rushed, compromised execution ended in catastrophe. Frank Piasecki was one of the most significant and inventive figures in early helicopter development. Born in 1919, he had studied engineering at the University of Pennsylvania and soon entered the small, rapidly emerging world of rotary wing flight. He had founded the Piasecki Helicopter Corporation in 1940, and its early experimental PV-2 became only the 3rd helicopter ever to fly in the United States. While his contemporaries like Sikorsky chased single-rotor designs, Piasecki's attention soon shifted towards multi-rotor configurations, leading to the PV-3, later developed into the HRP Rescuer, and the world's first successful tandem-rotor helicopter. From this lineage came the Piasecki H-21, a high-lift, cold-weather workhorse that became the most widely used tandem-rotor helicopter of its era. By the mid-1950s, however, Frank's relationship with his own company had collapsed. The board forced him out, and the original firm was soon acquired by Boeing, becoming Boeing Vertol, the division that would go on to develop the enormously successful Chinook family of tandem-rotor helicopters, and the ultimate expression of Frank Piasecki's pioneering twin-rotor vision. Frank, meanwhile, founded a new venture, the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation. From there, he pursued a series of experimental military contracts. There was the bizarre PA PA-59 Air Jeep, a low-flying twin-rotor compact flying jeep, and the high-speed 16H Pathfinder, among others. But running alongside these projects was a concept that Piasecki had been nurturing for years. In 1958, he filed the first patent for what he called the Helicopter and Balloon Aircraft Unit. Two twin-rotor helicopters, resembling early HRP rescuers without their exterior fuselage, are connected by a transverse beam structure. This joint locked the two aircraft together in yaw so they couldn't twist into each other, but allowed limited movement in pitch and roll relative to the frame. Moored to the centre of this structure was the large balloon, providing almost all the lifting force and thus freeing the helicopter rotors to focus purely on propulsion and control. Piasecki's patent accounted for quick release joints, so either helicopter could detach in an emergency, along with similar releases for both the balloon and the load cables. The patent soon made it to the New York Times, where it was described as an aircraft that combines two helicopters and a balloon, designed to transport heavy loads over mountains and jungles. The inventor believes his balloon-assisted helicopter lift will be especially useful in oil, mining and lumber companies for isolated operations. On a completely unrelated note, the Times also excitedly reported on a hog scratcher. A drawing in patent 3008452 shows a hog contentedly scratching its back against a moving belt and receiving, simultaneously, an application of insecticide. And if we look up the patent, 3008452, yep, that is a drawing of a content looking... I don't know why that makes me laugh so much. By 1971, the idea, the Helistat, not the hog scratcher, eventually moved into a full Department of Defense feasibility study. The study focused on two helicopters rigidly connected end to end and acting as a single heavy lift aircraft. The diagrams showed a deceptively simple setup that could be assembled in the field or on the deck of an aircraft carrier. The concept doesn't seem to have progressed much beyond a study phase, though the Piasecki Corporation seemed to eventually settle on a more ambitious quad-rotor layout that used four surplus Sikorsky H-53E helicopters designated the PA-39 and with a proposed payload capability of over 60 tons. A few years later, however, the same basic four-helicopter framework seemed to reappear, this time with a familiar addition, a large, non-rigid helium envelope mounted above the structure, returning the design to the hybrid configuration Frank Piasecki had envisioned back in the 1950s. This updated concept was pitched to the US Forestry Service, who were interested in heavy lift capabilities for removing logging material from remote forests, and in 1980 the proposals took a leap towards reality. The Helistat is a revolutionary new type of aircraft, which is composed of four helicopters mated to an airship. The Helistat is designed to provide heavy vertical lift capabilities that far exceed those available through the use of conventional helicopters. According to Helistat inventor Frank Piasecki, the Helistat will be able to lift about 26 tons, or twice as much as the largest commercial helicopter now in use in the US, and it will complete its mission with an estimated savings of 37% over conventional helicopter harvesting methods. So I've been doing a lot of drawing recently, and I thought I would take a crack at drawing the Helistat. And you can kind of see, when you study this concept that was released in the fact sheet by the US Forestry Service, you can really get an idea of the combination of Piasecki's earlier patent combined with some of the things that they had obviously learned and developed during that study into combining two helicopters end to end. But you have this lattice work frame here, which looks very similar to the framework that was used in that study. But you can also see that the original patent had more of a circular hot air balloon style gas bag, whereas this has a more conventional US Army blimp. And at this point, they were interested in looking at the idea of using surplus equipment. And ex-military blimps, which had been used up till the 1960s, I suppose was the basis for this idea. And what's interesting here is you can actually see, I think anyway, I've drawn them as UH-1 Bell Huey helicopters, that quite distinctive Vietnam-era helicopter design. Again, I suppose the idea being that they could be utilised as surplus for the construction of the Helistat. But yeah, quite an odd, futuristic vision of a gravity-defying vehicle. And it leads me quite neatly onto the pen that I used for drawing all of this, and today's sponsor, the Novium Hover Pen. I love my pens, I love my drawing, I love my writing as well too. In fact, a lot of the videos that you guys watch start their lives as notes sketched in a diary at some point using a pen. So as you can imagine, I'm always on the lookout for new writing implements, and the Novium Hover Pen combines this crazy, futuristic, gravity-defying design alongside a really rugged and reliable writing implement. And it really does hover. It's held at 23.5 degrees, a reference to the Earth's axial tilt. Novium make these out of space-grade aluminium, so they feel very weighty and very robust, but also balanced and comfortable in the hand, and it makes for a really nice writing and drawing experience. They also sent me the Hover Pen Future, which is especially nice as it has these interchangeable fountain and rollerball tips, and it is genuinely beautiful for writing in a nice notebook. They make a wonderful addition to a desk or study, but they're also a great gift idea. They come in these beautifully presented boxes, perfect for anyone into space, engineering, writing, or just interesting and unique design. The Hover Pen Interstellar comes in Space Black, Starlight Silver, Neptune Blue, or Mars Magma. There's even a special edition of the Interstellar which has a piece of real meteorite embedded in the tip of the pen, which is certainly a unique and special thing to have floating on your desk. So if you want to check out the Hover Pen or make it the perfect gift for someone you know, check the link in the description below. They ship pretty much everywhere: North America, Europe, the UK, Australia, and if you use my code CALLUM, you'll get 15% off for the next 72 hours and 10% off after that. So thanks again for the sponsor, Novium, and let's get back to the Helistat. Although the contract came through the Forest Service, the project would be funded and monitored by the US Navy's Air Development Center, which remained interested in whether the concept could fulfill the military's long-standing ambitions for rotor-powered aircraft capable of carrying tanks and other heavy equipment. Piasecki himself seemed keenly aware of this, saying, "The Navy may want to get into its own specific designs. It's possible to make one carry a 65-ton battle tank." The initial prototype would be built at Lakehurst, where the facilities, materials, and lighter-than-air expertise still existed, and the Forest Service were hopeful not just about the business case for the project, but also its promise of a speedy delivery. The contract was awarded to Piasecki in January 1980, and it is valued at $10.7 million. Most of the development costs for the Helistat could be offset by the sale of timber logged by the new aircraft during its initial tests, to be conducted in the national forests in the Pacific Northwest. Piasecki's Helistat design was selected by the Forest Service because the firm could deliver the completed vehicle in 2 years, instead of the 5 years needed by other potential builders. The Helistat was not ready for testing and trials by the end of fall 1981, as the US Forest Service had excitedly claimed in their fact sheet. By August 1982, there was still no sign of a finished Helistat. A report stated that the Helistat was a year behind schedule and 13% over its initial $10.7 million government contract. A Piasecki spokesman at the time was quoted saying that, "We've had some unforeseen technical problems, but any one-of-a-kind vehicle is bound to have setbacks." One of Frank Piasecki's selling points for the Helistat was that it could use surplus existing equipment to keep costs down. But much of the airship equipment no longer even existed in surplus. A report stated that Piasecki is cutting costs by using surplus materials. The 20-year-old blimp, once used for military surveillance over the Atlantic, is the only Navy surplus airbag left. However, the Navy in fact possessed no surplus airbags, as a 1983 magazine detailed. The blimp envelope, for example, was saved from destruction through an elaborate ruse involving a request by an air aviation museum in the Midwest, asking the Navy to hold on to the blimp until arrangements could be made for their display in a museum. In actuality, the museum had no intention of doing so. Another newspaper noted that the equipment had then been found after it had been hidden away behind dummy walls in the base when the airship division had been closed in the 1960s. The helicopters being used were similarly vintage. Early sketches seem to depict the use of Bell UH-1 Hueys, but instead it was 4 Sikorsky H-34Js that found their tails being cut off and hoisted onto the growing frame. The spidery network of scaffolding that held the strange aircraft together was being constructed using sections of metal tubing, and in some places lightweight aluminium irrigation pipes. As Piasecki mentioned, you can't do a job like this for the amount we have unless you scrounge. The same article noted, doubters who scoff at the Helistat's potential note that the site of the development is where the Hindenburg went down in flames in 1937. Whether the Helistat will be a daydream come true or a nightmarish folly is something only time will tell. Only a couple of years in, worried parties were increasingly concerned it was the latter. In November 1982, a federal review by the US General Accounting Office painted a worrying picture of the Helistat's development. In 1979, the estimated net cost of the programme was $6.7 million, a figure that assumed the sale of harvested timber would offset the Helistat's development costs. By the end of 1982, timber prices had collapsed, while the development of the Helistat had overrun, bringing the net cost to at least $31.7 million, well over $100 million in today's money. Far more troubling, however, was the picture that began to emerge about the Helistat's engineering. According to visiting Navy, NASA and FAA officials, design of the interconnecting structure, the central frame that held the blimp and 4 helicopters together, had run from January 1981 through October 1982. Fabrication of the structure had begun in March 1981 and continued through November. Thus, the structure was being built long before the design was completed. A NASA official who attended a critical design review found that analysis of various joints around the structure had been done incorrectly, and FAA officials identified numerous problems in the overall construction, including poor welding, out-of-tolerance dimensions, spliced or patched tubes, scored and dented tube ends, and insufficient cleaning of bonded surfaces. Beyond the clear concerns in the construction, design and engineering of the Helistat, the report stressed more fundamental issues with the project itself. There was still no credible timeline for completion, making any final costs unknown, and even if the Helistat were completed, there was almost no industry interest. The Forest Service had not contacted potential users before starting the project. When the accounting office for their report contacted dozens of logging companies and associations, almost none expressed interest in the concept as a practical logging tool. The scathing report caused quite a stir in the media, but Frank Piasecki was quick to defend the project, as were forestry officials. "We still believe it's a good idea," said David Jolly, Deputy Director of Timber Management for the Forest Service. "It may look a little crazy, but the potential benefits are worth some risk." Besides Igor Sikorsky, there were few names more famous in the world of helicopter flight than Frank Piasecki. He was a pioneer, a visionary whose confidence had helped push the development of rotary wing aviation forward, and he had seen more than one project succeed after being called insane for even trying. To Piasecki, the criticism from bureaucrats and government analysts was nothing new, just one more in a chorus of voices that had insisted over his career that his ideas would never work. In one 1983 newspaper article on the Helistat, Piasecki recalled building his first helicopter from junk auto parts in a rented Philadelphia garage in the early 1940s. Almost 40 years later, Piasecki found himself in a remarkably similar situation, fending off the same kind of doubters as his vast Helistat came together from recycled parts and aging surplus equipment. He had proved his doubters wrong before, and he remained as confident as ever that he would do it again. But by 1984, there was still no sign of the Helistat. US Senator William Proxmire described the project as a mechanical mongrel after he awarded it his Golden Fleece Award, an infamous trophy given out to the public officials in the United States who squandered public money. The machine, 343 feet long, 187 feet wide and 111 feet high, is supposed to lift logs from national forests. Instead, its main success will be in lifting the taxpayer's wallet, Proxmire said. The Forest Service has admitted that the cost of the project ballooned from $26 million to nearly $40 million for this one-of-a-kind aerial vehicle. They originally intended to test the machine in May 1982. That date has now slipped to January 1986, and may slip further. 6 years after the contract was signed and tens of millions of dollars over budget, the Helistat was finally edging towards its first flight tests. But what emerged from the Lakehurst hangar was a far cry from the glossy concept art that had been circulating in the early 1980s. The finished machine was looking tired before it ever even left the ground. A 20-year-old blimp envelope, 4 mismatched 30-year-old helicopters with their tails cut off, and a latticework frame made from fabricated pipework and irrigation tubing. The Sikorsky H-34s had needed major additions to get the Helistat in the air. The entire craft sat on a set of precarious-looking landing gear, described by some as shopping cart casters. Worst of all, they had no brakes at all. The idea was to let the Helistat drift with the wind on the ground, much like a normal moored airship swings around its nose into the wind. But without brakes or any steering control, the moment the wind shifted, the whole machine could, and made landing a potential nightmare. Still, it was a concept, not a completed product, and Piasecki needed to press ahead as both funding and patience was finally getting to its end. In April, developers were telling reporters that the Helistat was scheduled for its first free flight this month, touting it as the largest aircraft in the world, capable of lifting 24 tons of cargo and potentially serving roles from offshore oil work to anti-submarine warfare. But when it did finally tentatively lift off the ground, it had begun to wobble and sway, visibly unstable even in the calm air. Moments later, it had come down hard, smashing the left front landing gear and sending the teams back to the drawing board. A Forest Service spokesman, shown a tape of the test, admitted there has been some concern about control problems and the stability of the aircraft, and the test showed that these concerns were justified. Another statement, somewhat defensively, added, "I'm not sure how much they were actually trying to achieve. Obviously, they didn't expect it to fly all over New Jersey." It was a curious statement, considering that years earlier, the Helistat had been promised in only 28 months and to be flying above forests harvesting timber for the Forestry Service. By the 23rd of June, Forest Service officials were meeting at Washington, D.C. to discuss the project's future. A second meeting was to happen on the 1st of July, and on the 2nd of July, they would gather at Lakehurst, where officials could review the aircraft, question Piasecki, and finally decide what would happen to the mechanical mongrel. For the teams working day and night to try and get the Helistat airborne, time was truly running out. Around 6:15 on the evening of the 1st of July 1986, the Helistat was rolled out for another test. Lewis Berman, the Navy's program manager for the Helistat, stood behind the video camera filming this latest test as they had done on previous flights. At 6:45 p.m, Master Pilot Bernal Stutzman released the Helistat from the mooring mast. Stutzman, an experienced pilot with more than 20,000 hours in rotorcraft, sat in the left rear helicopter designated number 1. He sat alongside co-pilot Lewis Prost, a blimp pilot in charge of the airship above them. This helicopter would serve as the master cockpit, the only place where the Helistat's collective controls came together. Each of the other 3 helicopters carried a single crewman. There was number 2, forward on the left side, flown by Gary Olshfski. There was number 3 on the right front, with Michael Stock aboard, and number 4 on the right rear, flown by Kenneth Reusser. Together, the 4 cockpits were linked by a maze of mechanical and electrical linkages running through the interconnecting frame, letting Stutzman command all 4 helicopters at once, at least in theory. That evening, the wind blew a steady 8 knots from the southeast, but could be unpredictable as it swirled around the massive hangars. Now, loosed from the mooring mast, the engines of the 4 helicopters roared, applying forward thrust to counteract the Helistat drifting in the wind. The crew in the 3 auxiliary cockpits called out instrument readings and control responses. Stutzman worked the controls while Prost attempted to hold the Helistat level. Perhaps aware of how this may be the final make-or-break flight, the Helistat finally managed to lift off. Hovering at 40, 50, maybe even 60 feet, Lewis Berman calls out on the tape. It manages to hover at this height for around 8 minutes, exceeding anything they had been able to achieve before. Feeling confident, Stutzman decided to practice a landing before requesting permission for a 100-foot hover. Elated to finally see the Helistat in the air after so many failed attempts and years of development, Gary Olshfski in helicopter number 2 calls out on the radio. That was a great birthday present. It would be his last words. As they touched down for the landing, number 3 helicopter's engine suddenly seemed to drop below 2,100 revolutions per minute. Stutzman, seeing this, radios that he now intends to stop the test and bring the Helistat back to its mooring. But now the ship's nose is turning past the wind direction and not stopping. Stutzman applies right rudder to try and point it towards the wind, but rather than turning, it begins accelerating and rolling on its landing gear across the tarmac. The Helistat, with its freewheeling landing gear, was, as Stutzman described it, an acre of sail on roller skates, and now seemingly at the mercy of the wind and at least one malfunctioning helicopter. Stutzman, keeping on right rudder, applies controls for reverse thrust. Now the entire vehicle seems to groan, forces pulling the rickety structure in multiple directions. Reports indicate that the landing gear now began to shimmy, and a distinctive chatter rings out through the frame of the Helistat. Stutzman, in the master cockpit, must have realised quickly what was happening. The vibration seemed to be building into ground resonance, a dangerous phenomena caused by the helicopter's rotor blades shifting out of sync and shaking the helicopter's body and landing gear. The endless building feedback loop of vibrations could be catastrophic, especially when applied across the entire untested airframe of the Helistat. Stutzman knew in that moment the only way to counteract the building ground resonance would be to take off and get away from the ground. Applying forward thrust for a rolling takeoff, he needed to get airborne fast. As the video shows, the Helistat now tips upwards, but it's too late. Number 4 helicopter on the back right can be seen falling backwards, tearing itself free from the frame. As the structure begins to fail, Stutzman's helicopter on the opposite side is seen shaking before also beginning to fall. The footage is grainy, but Stutzman, sitting in the pilot's seat of his helicopter on the back left, can be seen thrown around by the violent shuddering as the aircraft rips apart. The entire structure is now compromised. This footage, shot from further back on the runway, shows number 4 falling first, then followed by number 1 and 2 on the left-hand side breaking off almost simultaneously. Number 3 on the front right falls last as shrapnel, or perhaps the frame tearing from the balloon, rips open the envelope. The vintage airship, shedding the weight of the falling helicopters, now lifts one final time before folding in and crashing to the ground. On the camera footage, the sound of helicopter engines roaring on the ground and rotors still spinning can be heard. A woman watching the catastrophe unfold screams. Some reports claim in the video footage that one onlooker can be heard cursing Frank Piasecki. It might be the sounds heard here. One crewman, Gary Olshfski, was killed instantly when the number 2 helicopter that he was piloting hit the tarmac. The other 4 crew members survived, 3 with major injuries. Michael Stock of helicopter number 3 managed to escape with an injured arm and took a photo of the crash in the seconds after he escaped his mangled cockpit. Gary Olshfski had flown helicopters all over the world, from Vietnam to Alaska and the Amazon. He had spent 5 years in the US Marine Corps, including a year as a helicopter gunship pilot in Vietnam. Obsessed with engineering and especially helicopters, he was also an experienced teacher. He had received a bachelor's and a master's in education, as well as a degree in engineering from the University of Tennessee. As well as working as a flight engineer for the Piasecki Aircraft Corporation on the Helistat project, he was also a captain in the National Guard. A friend said of him, "Gary was always fascinated by helicopters. Having a chance to work for Piasecki, who was in his eyes a pioneer, I guess Gary felt he was a pioneer too." Gary's widow said, "He had such potential. He could talk to the pilots and the engineers. His best skill was communication. Though he wanted to be the best, it wasn't in a competitive way. He was very supportive of others." In 1983, Gary had stumbled upon a plane that had crashed into a lake. The pilot was trapped inside as it sunk under the water. Pushing past shocked witnesses, he dived from a bridge into the lake, pulling the man from the plane, who unfortunately later died of his injuries. Gary figured it was a pilot, and if he were in that situation, he'd want someone to help him. Mrs. Olshfski said that she has started scrapbooks about her husband for each of their children. Their father was a special man. I want them to know that. It would be months of delays before the reports emerged finally about the causes of the crash. Investigators later concluded that the crash resulted from a chain of problems. Missed throttle linkages and a control system anomaly may have been what caused number 3's speed to suddenly drop, throwing the entire vehicle out of balance. The Helistat's free castering landing gear had been designed to let it move on the ground with the wind, but it had impacted control, and the design had led to the violent shaking. The structural weaknesses in the interconnecting frame, highlighted years earlier by NASA, Navy and FAA engineers, finally gave up along one or multiple failure points, resulting in the Helistat eventually shaking itself apart. The sunk cost fallacy describes our human tendency to continue with an endeavour simply because of the money, effort or time already invested, even when in reality the costs clearly outweigh the benefits. To those who have invested that time, that money or that effort though, the reality isn't so clear. In fact, it can create a delusion, a misplaced belief that an undertaking must succeed purely because of the sheer amount of work already poured into it. The Helistat project was cancelled almost immediately following the crash. In 1991, 5 years after the disaster, the family of Gary Olshfski received $1.5 million in settlement from the government. Despite the dramatic end to the Helistat, the dream of the hybrid or heavy lift airship certainly didn't die. In the years after, similar concepts were attempted, many with great success. Yet, returning to the Helistat's audit from 1982, one of the key criticisms, separate from the engineering concerns, was that commercial interest in large cargo airships was virtually non-existent. Perhaps the most forward-thinking element of the project was actually Piasecki's earlier four-rotor studies that didn't utilise a balloon, the so-called MHHLS, conceptually similar to the modern quadcopter drone. But much like how the age of the airship was ushered out by the dramatic Hindenburg disaster, the dream of Piasecki's hybrid airship helicopter Helistat also seems confined to the past, where it all came to an end, much like the Hindenburg, on the runways of Lakehurst. Well, thanks to everyone who watched this far. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the PA-97 Helistat. I really didn't think there was all that much to this story until I started digging into the newspapers, sort of reading this timeline to disaster, reading the warnings, the reports, the criticisms, and knowing tragically how it was all going to end. It has properly consumed me for these last few months, and I'm really glad to have had the chance to share it with you all. Big thanks to the person on Reddit about 4 years ago who tagged me in a comment about this and said, oh, you should make a video about this. And I ignored them, thinking it wasn't a very interesting topic, and it came roaring back into my head years and years later. A big thanks, as always, to my patrons over at Patreon, patreon.com/CallumRassi, and a big thanks to Novium. Check out their amazing floating pens in the link below, and don't forget to use my code Callum for 15% off for the next 72 hours and 10% after that. I had a lot of fun drawing the Helistat. I've not had a chance to do much drawing as of late. I used to do this quite a lot, where I would draw the plans and depictions of the subject that I was covering, and I'd like to get back into doing that. Maybe I'll try finishing this drawing and I'll put it on like a t-shirt or a hat or something. Watch this space. Anyway, thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.